The village of Ez on the French Riviera is the essence of the traditional Mediterranean coastline. A dramatic medieval village, it is constructed out of local stone and looks like a pinnacle of the mountaintop on which it stands. The narrow cobblestone streets provide relief from the traffic of the bustling world. The azure sea and red-tiled roofs make it a vacationer's dream, and it's a dream that is pursued every year by countless thousands of tourists. But it is a dream. The reality is different.
Brought to you by Overseas National Airways Destination Philadelphia, Cape Nord. Aftermeter afvlugmeet L2 vlugnummer 7. Daarin Sumaska nummer 3 gebeten.
Passengers on Tampa flight 05 to Gatwick, exit gate number 4.
Every year, over 100 million tourists flock to the Mediterranean for a few weeks of sun on its shores. To these visitors, the Mediterranean still looks like a beautiful open-air swimming pool, but it has become one of the world's biggest open sewers. And it's these seasonal residents that aggravate the problem. 80% of the sewage from the Mediterranean towns flows into the sea only partially treated or not treated at all. And yet, for the people who live here all year round, the sea is a provider. For these fishermen in Alexandria, it's a source of both food and livelihood. This catch will be the main source of protein in their diet. But the tourists are not the only ones to blame. For years, the Mediterranean nations themselves have used the sea as a dump. Chemical wastes from industries are poured directly into the sea or the rivers that feed it. Added with sewage, these factory wastes make up what is categorized as land-based pollution. In total, it contributes 85% of all pollution going into the sea. As a result, today the Mediterranean resembles a heavily polluted lake. Something needs to be done to save it. But the Mediterranean is surrounded by 18 countries, often antagonistic. Some are even at war. This complicates any efforts to clean it up. Yet, as unlikely as it may seem, it has already begun, and largely because of the vision of one man. It's 6:45 on an October morning in Geneva. The office is UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program. "47-year-old Dr. Stefan Keshkesh arrives to begin his day. He heads a small UN team that is coordinating pollution control projects in 8 seas around the world. But Keshkesh's main endeavor is a plan for the protection of the Mediterranean. Success or failure of this Mediterranean action plan will have enormous implications for the future of the other polluted seas of the world. And it looks as though it will be successful, for after 2.5 years of intense negotiations, representatives from most of the Mediterranean countries have agreed upon the text for a treaty to control land-based pollution. However, it has yet to be signed. This film tells the story of how Dr. Keshkesh and his group brought about this unlikely treaty. It all really started 8 years ago. The UN got involved as a result of the Stockholm Conference on World Environment in 1972. Together with the emotional demonstration outside, this meeting marked the peak of the concern shown by the people of the world for the environment. Pollution had become a global issue that needed cooperative international action. But the UN knew it couldn't tackle all the problems at once, so it gave priority to the seas, and in particular, the Mediterranean. The beginning of Dr. Keshkesh's action plan was these declarations of 1972.
And in my view, this declaration has got to be seen as important for what it does contain at this point, rather than what it does not contain. And if it were to contain nothing more than that principle that nations must accept responsibility for the actions, for the consequences of their actions on others, in my view, it would be a historic document and an extremely important base on which to build.
7 years later, the Mediterranean countries have already made progress.
The results obtained up to now show that the most important sources of pollution are located in the northwestern part of the European coast.
Already, the Mediterranean nations have reached an agreement not to dump dangerous chemicals in the sea, and to collaborate in an emergency such as a tanker collision. Not taxing demands, but the strategy of Keshkesh is one of gradualism. The crucial and expensive agreement has yet to come. Meanwhile, everyone is still talking. Much of the credit for this belongs to Stefan Keshkesh. His hometown is Rovinj on the Adriatic coast of Yugoslavia. It is a typical Mediterranean fishing town which symbolizes the problems the treaty will have to deal with. The resident population of 8,000 increases to 40,000 for the summer, with all the disruptions that go with such an increase. The social fabric of this town has been wrecked. Many fishermen have stopped fishing, some enticed by the easier profits of the tourist trade, others because their trade has been destroyed by overfishing. Still others blame pollution. Keshkesh began his career here as a scientist at the Rovinj Marine Research Institute, one of the oldest in the Mediterranean. Surveying the bacteriological and chemical contamination of the sea is its basic activity. At that time, it became clear to Keshkesh that data of this kind was needed on the state of the Mediterranean as a whole. His experience has led him to believe that the foundation of any effective plan must be the gathering of reliable data. And when he became director of the action plan, that is what he organized: common standards for monitoring throughout all of the countries. 5 years ago, his laboratory in Rovinj was one of less than a dozen marine laboratories in just 4 countries. Now there are 84 laboratories in 16 countries, monitoring the effects of pollution in the Mediterranean. Ironically, one of the problems literally facing the Institute was that of pollution of the sea no more than a few yards from its front door.
Now, it is easy to say that it should not happen, that the sea is dirty, in front of an institution which is in charge of making research and recommendations how to avoid this sort of things. But what really we would have to examine, what are the causes? Why does it happen that in spite of the goodwill, declared goodwill of the governments, of the people, of the scientists, these things do happen? Pollution here around of us is really coming from our best neighbor, a factory, a small fish canning factory. A couple of hundred workers working with relatively primitive technology, trying to cope with everyday problems, trying to improve their living standards. And the pollution we see around us is to a certain extent part of this fight for better life. what they would have to do to avoid this sort of nuisance is to build a treatment plant, waste treatment plant. But to build a waste treatment plant would mean sacrificing part of their income, and the question is not so much whether they are ready to do it, but the question is whether they can afford to do it.
Being in Yugoslavia, the fish factory is a cooperative, and therefore the costs of a waste treatment plant would come out of the workers' income. It's a sacrifice they are not prepared to make. This epitomizes the economic and political reality of the problem. From Rovinj, if you follow the Yugoslav coast south about 20 miles past the resort of Pula, the map reveals a sharp turn to the north into a semi-enclosed stretch of sea. The development proposed for this coastal region gave Kesh an insight into the much larger problems facing the Mediterranean. He saw Rijeka Bay as a microcosm of the Mediterranean as a whole. At the entrance to the bay, small hilltop villages look out over an expanse of inviting sea. As you move into and around the bay, however, the small fishing villages have progressively turned into centers for tourism. Here are the changes that have affected many parts of the Mediterranean coast over the past 30 years. Changes that have come from the demands of the Northern Europeans for their annual few weeks of sun and sea. At Opacha, you find the massive concrete complexes of hotels and tourist developments that have grown in just the past 4 or 5 years. They receive a revenue from tourism of over $200 million a year. These new developments do pollute the bay, but so far on a scale that can be managed. The sea is still healthy and clean. Halfway around the bay, the type of development changes with a change in the regional authority. Rijeka itself is pushing ahead rapidly with development of large-scale heavy industry, and this has brought about major long-term damage. The bay beyond this inlet was once a breeding ground for shrimp. The inlet itself has been sacrificed to a layer of silt from an ore terminal, and there is serious pollution from a new coking plant. The Rijeka region is committed to industry. After all, Yugoslavia cannot afford to live off tourism alone when 1 million of its people have to go abroad to find work. So where a shipyard or oil terminal could be financed and built, it has been, and the process is accelerating. Beside the resort of Amaselja on the island of Kirk, a massive development is taking place that represents the largest industrial investment in Yugoslavia's history. The Dow Chemical Corporation made an offer to the Yugoslav government that it couldn't refuse. Dow Chemical offered the finance and technology for a large new petrochemical complex. Kesh and his colleagues at the Rovinj Institute argued that this development ignored the capacity of the bay to survive the inevitable industrial spillings. They also felt it was on a scale that was inappropriate to Rijeka Bay. But their protests were ignored, a fact that strongly convinced Kesh of the importance of the role of the scientist in the Mediterranean Action Plan.
The politician should not be allowed to bypass an opinion expressed by the scientific community when it has to judge the economic and ecological soundness of certain investment, of certain measure. But the decision should be taken, obviously, taking into account much wider concern, not only about the ecological consequences, but economic and political consequences. So all what we are trying in the framework of the Mediterranean Action Plan, we are trying to provide a sound basis for a decision-making process.
That sound basis can only be achieved by scientific assessment of the marine environment. These scientists were part of the team that investigated Rijeka Bay. Like Kesh, they now regard their report as little more than a post-mortem. Yet they have not given up hope. They believe that planners and industrialists have learned a costly lesson, upon which a better relationship can be constructed. On this particular trip, the researchers will be surveying the coastal waters and sea bottom off the Adriatic town of Novigrad. The clarity of the Mediterranean is striking. One reason for this is a lack of turbulence. But clarity doesn't mean purity, for many dangerous pollutants are invisible. Agricultural pesticides that enter the sea from the rivers, and chemicals and metal residues from factory effluents. The danger of these pollutants lies not in concentrations that are toxic in themselves, but in their slow accumulation in organisms. This is why you need long-term monitoring, returning again and again to the same place to sample organisms, water, and sediments. Surprisingly, part of the new understanding from the last few years is that the open sea is still relatively healthy, sufficient enough to give us hope that the present trend of increasing pollution could be reversed. Yet there is no excuse for complacency. Even though the Mediterranean waters are completely replaced every 80 years, mainly from the Atlantic, the sediments, once poisoned, lie there virtually forever. Now the Mediterranean countries pool their research, but to avoid embarrassment, data is not published country by country, but by carefully drawn regions which are unrelated to national boundaries. This is another example of Keshkesh's diplomacy.
The layman might feel that this vast amount of paper is unnecessary, and sometimes even the governments feel that this vast amount of paper is unnecessary. But we are quite convinced that the psychological effects of this amount of paper is quite important, because after all, the governments have to be convinced when they are getting our recommendation that these recommendations have been based on a very sound technical ground. And these documents are providing really the evidence that the recommendations are based on technical grounds. So the psychological impact of this amount of paper is very important.
Now, in September 1978, the story moves to Malta. A meeting of economists, scientists, and technicians from 17 of the 18 countries, and representatives of the specialized UN agencies, WHO, FAO, and so on, all working under the guidance of Keshkesh and his team. Politically, this is an extraordinary meeting, for in the same room there are delegates from Lebanon and Libya, Israel and Syria, Greece and Turkey, Morocco and Italy, all talking about the environment. Only Albania is missing. No one will walk out. Unlike many international meetings which end in deadlock, it seems that the environment keeps people talking and searching for ways to agree. And these meetings are not only bringing different nations together. It has been said that people from different ministries within the same government have met for the first time at these conferences. What Keshkesh has created is a kind of club from which no nation would like to be the first to pull out. Each has a vested interest. The less developed nations are searching for technical assistance. The richer nations want to sell anti-pollution equipment. And all might gain, for example, through improved fisheries and reduction of disease. A lot of the most useful work goes on outside the actual meeting. On the terrace, diplomatic language is abandoned, and Kesh can come to grips with the difficulties which cannot be expressed openly. What has become clear is that there are no ready-made technical solutions for the Mediterranean as a whole. The problems of each country are different. For example, moving eastwards from Yugoslavia, clockwise around the Mediterranean, we arrive in Athens. Here, the problems have been clearly revealed as a result of a unique pollution control project, investigating urban pollution and including the problem of domestic wastes. Over the past 20 years or so, Athens has expanded so quickly that the old network of sewers is completely inadequate. Out of Athens' population of 2.5 million people, 1.5 million have no main drainage. Instead, a fleet of trucks is used to empty thousands of cesspools located all over the city. Every day, 1,500 loads of well-fermented human waste are brought to a single disposal point about 10 miles from the center of Athens. At the disposal point, there is no treatment plant. The trucks simply drive up and then wait. Inevitably, there are holdups, and they have to stand in line in the hot sun. Eventually, a flexible pipe is connected to each truck, and the sewage goes into an underground pipeline, the diameter of the average living room, which conducts the sewage straight to the sea. The pollution control project, set up by the Greek government with the assistance of the World Health Organization, is under the direction of engineer Alexander Gilad. It is Gilad's brief to survey pollution problems and to provide recommendations.
We are now close to the point where sewage of about 2 million inhabitants of Athens and a large portion of the industrial establishment in the area is discharged, virtually untreated. The portion of the sea here is overloaded with the domestic and industrial discharges. At the bottom of the sea here, there is a thick and wide blanket of sludge that has been created through sedimentation of the solid material in the sewage.
And the sludge beneath these waters killed off all the marine life. This sludge is a source of potentially dangerous bacteria. This does not have to be the case. The sea can absorb sewage if there isn't too much of it, and it's well dispersed. And sunlight, given a sufficient penetration, can kill the dangerous pathogens.
We know that bacteria die and disappear in the aquatic environment rather quickly. Our laboratory tests have shown that 90% of the bacteria disappear between half an hour and 10 hours, depending on the intensity of light.
So the sea can deal with our domestic wastes, provided they are released in the right place. There, the pathogens can be destroyed long before they are carried into bathing areas. A new sewage system for Athens is in the planning stage. It will include main drainage for the entire urban population, a partial treatment plant to remove solids, and a new pipeline to disperse the liquid wastes. Greek experts working with British consultants have tailored their plans to the local conditions. Engineer Steve Myers.
The fact is that to implement a scheme of sewage treatment alone for Athens city will cost, until the end of the century, something of the order of £700 million. This is a cost which the Mediterranean citizen has not yet had to face before.
To make the plan more acceptable, the Athenians have been offered a range of possible pipelines. Now that the condition of the sea is understood, they can choose one of the cheaper plans, knowing at least that it will do the job safely. Yet a problem with the present plan is that it deals with the disposal of domestic wastes only. Industrial wastes will require a separate plan. Also, the present Athens solution requires rigid zoning of the coast. Some recreational areas will be saved, but others will be written off forever. Stefan Keshkesh.
You will not be able to save everything. You will have to sacrifice, in the name of progress, certain parts of the coast and maybe even certain parts of the sea and use it as a dumping ground. But if you do it in order to save the rest and to make the rest even better, this is the right way to do it. Athens is a perfect example how in practice it can be done. The environmental situation, the quality of life in Athens was deteriorating so fast in a couple of last years that the public pressure was ripe, the government was ready, money was found, scientists and technicians could find a solution, and all this joint effort resulted in a solution which is at hand. Through this solution, Athens will be a cleaner city.
Even though Athens will be cleaner, these sections of the coast will never be saved. They will always be a reminder of the effects of the uncontrolled development over the last 30 years. Moving further east around the Mediterranean, we come to the Golden Horn in Istanbul. Just as the pressures on the environment vary from country to country, so do the attitudes of the people. Religion, history, and economic conditions can all affect public concern. For the Mediterranean Action Plan to succeed, all the needs and desires and attitudes of the local residents must be considered. Turkey shows how important these local concerns are, for here environmental movements have mostly developed in the coastal towns, where people have found their own interests threatened. Near Istanbul, the decline in fish catches in 1973 and 74 alerted people to the dangers of pollution. Mackerel and swordfish almost disappeared, and for a people who eat a lot of fish, this was a powerful stimulus. The development of Turkish environmental groups shows that such organizations are not confined to the wealthy societies of North America and Western Europe. The approach in Turkey is just as sophisticated and well supported. Lawyer Selahattin Yildirim.
We started off as an anti-pollution organization, and that was just a single-purpose organization. And we soon saw that the anti-pollution approach itself is not enough to deal with a very complex problem, which is an environmental problem. And we changed our single-purpose approach to a multi-purpose approach, which includes economical, social, and cultural side of the environment.
Selahattin Yildirim's organization is called the Union of Municipalities. It confronts local industrialists with petitions, protests, and legal action. They have successfully sued more than 200 companies. In their small headquarters, they coordinate the activities of mayors and local officials in the 92 municipalities that have joined the union. And they have a small permanent staff to send out literature, deal with the press, and provide legal and technical advice to their members.
Hem telefon etmeye çalışıyorum, hem çıkartamıyorum, hem toplantıdayım.
Gebze, one of the most active municipalities in the Union, is located about 20 miles from Istanbul. Foreign visitors here are surprised when they realize that the Turkish people have very strong environmental consciousness. One reason for this consciousness is that the Turks are an Islamic people. Their religion teaches that the land, the air, and the water are sacred. And these are also people whose rural past is close enough to make them sensitive to the freshly felt horrors of rapid industrialization.
What we have been experiencing in Turkey in the last 10 years is a very striking fact with respect to the people's consciousness and consciousness of their own affairs. What I mean is that traditionally in Ottoman Turkish time and in Turkish Republic time, people used to wait from above, from the central authorities, everything they need, and they used to go to the very top man in both in central and local authorities. But nowadays, a new approach is being experienced in Turkey, which is that people are no more that keen on going to a very top man, but to the man who is the closest to them and who has got the potentiality of dealing with his affairs more realistically and more responsive to them.
In Gebze, perhaps the newly elected mayor will be such a leader. Together with his deputy and a lawyer from the Union of Municipalities, he will spend the morning visiting several industries on the outskirts of the town. Until recently, he was a worker at one of the local factories. He became involved in the union through its petitioning activities. But now, as mayor, he takes an active part in sorting out pollution problems. The first stop is at a chemical plant that makes products for the cosmetic and textile industries. Not a big polluter, this small factory has nevertheless fouled a stream and disrupted a village community on the outskirts of Gebze. There are thousands of factories like this one around the Mediterranean, and usually a visit like this will be enough to make a manager more careful. And if only each factory would be just a little more careful, then the environment as a whole would be much better off. As it turned out, this was not a situation where legal action was needed. An adequate treatment facility was the problem. Using less detergent in the factory's cleaning operations was the answer. One thing the factory manager could not do was buy new treatment equipment. It would have to be imported, and he could not obtain the foreign exchange that would be needed. Meanwhile, until there is stronger enforcement of legislation in Turkey, this is the impact on the coastal environment of the outfall of a single factory. The mayor's next stop is a multinational corporation. Often greater pressure can be put on foreign-owned companies. The use of their money to buy treatment equipment is not considered a threat to the local economy. As it turned out, this firm had already installed expensive equipment to deal with their waste byproducts, and they'd used their own foreign currency to pay for the new treatment plant. Even so, the mayor asked if the factory could do more. They admitted that they could, but asked if it would be fair when other nearby factories were doing much less than they were, And even if this factory did do more, it would have little impact on the sea because of the pollution from other neighboring factories. In Turkey, there is need for a more rigorous approach. Some incidents at the largest coastal petrochemical complex showed the severity of the problem. Here, electrical failures on several occasions have caused chemicals to be released into the air, where they reacted to produce dangerous gases. 7 deaths occurred. And the reaction of the government was only to say, "Just close your windows." In Gebze, a long list of pollution problems has led to the setting up of a petition. People have gathered at the town to sign their names. And the attached statement reads, "We who are living on the coast of Marmara don't want the sea to die. We want a clean coast and sea. We want to benefit from the sea's resources. We are working in this area and we live in this region. We support the measures taken by the municipality of the Union. But the problem is now a national one, and central government should take measures against pollution." This kind of appeal is of crucial help to the Mediterranean Action Plan. Stefan Keşkeş and his colleagues believe that without effective grassroots pressure, there is little chance of governments enforcing national legislation to deal with their environmental problems, let alone ratifying international agreements.
Benim önümden geçin, bana bakmadan.
At last it's finished, and the petition is presented to the mayor.
Biz altında imzaları bulunan Gebze halkı olaraktan Başbakanlığımıza iletilmek üzere seçilmiş temsilcimiz olarak size 20. asrın en büyük belası olan...
The mayor responds with the assurance that it will be delivered to the Prime Minister's office. These people are taking an important step towards protecting their environment. And perhaps now, their government will be able to respond to their petition.
The saving of the environment is frequently a costly business, and therefore it requires an absolute public support. In Turkey, as we have seen, this support exists. It will help the government to implement the national laws, the national legislation, which does exist. So very frequently, it is not the question of existence and non-existence of national legislation. It's a question of enforcement of legislation. And the broad national support, public support to the enforcement of legislation is just a tool in the hands of governments which helps enforcement of the national legislation. By signing international treaties, like the treaty which would control the pollution from land-based sources in the Mediterranean, countries will have an even stronger management tool, because by signing the treaty, the government will be able to enforce this legislation, not only because it is a national law, but also because it is an international obligation of Turkey and all other signatories to do it.
Now we've moved south across the Mediterranean to Egypt and the River Nile. Problems that affect the Mediterranean may originate far inland from the coastal areas. The Nile once provided the largest contribution of fresh water and nutrients to the sea. Without the Nile, the eastern Mediterranean might become like the Dead Sea. Yet can we expect the people who live on its banks, 100 miles from the sea, to worry about the future of the Mediterranean? They are more concerned with their own conditions of appalling overcrowding and poverty. In Egypt, the people in the slums of Shubra beside the Nile have no conception of the importance of the river to their future, let alone to that of the Mediterranean. They are too busy living a hand-to-mouth existence. The average per capita income in Egypt is $200 a year. Sweeping up the sewage, digging out the blocked drains that flood each morning, is how they start the day. Someone who understands Egypt's problems and who is now working with Keshkesh is Egyptian economist Sabri Abdallah.
We are trying to develop Egypt, and we are trying to keep in mind the environmental issues, but we may commit mistakes in this respect.
The new irrigation scheme at Shubra. Could this turn out to be a long-term mistake? The Egyptians are planning to quadruple the amount of water drawn from the Nile for irrigation purposes. The Egyptian Ministry of Irrigation regards each drop of water that flows to the sea as wasted, unless it is used in some way to irrigate the desert. Manipulation of the Nile on a massive scale is unavoidable if Egypt is to deal with poverty. For thousands of years, the prosperity of the Egyptians has depended on their success in conquering and manipulating the Nile. But now that the scale of what is possible is so different from the traditional methods, this success brings with it its own problems. The agricultural land of the Delta is threatened in two ways. First, since the Aswan Dam was built, the Nile no longer brings rich flood sediments from its upper reaches. The Delta, which is composed mostly of ancient mud, is no longer being replenished. Yet the importance of this land for a country which now imports half its food cannot be overestimated. Second is the problem that the best farmland is now being lost to urban sprawl, as fast as new areas are being irrigated. On the outskirts of Cairo, you can see the most wasteful use of this good land. The whole population is crammed into a narrow ribbon of land on both sides of the Nile, in an area only 3% of the size of the entire territory. This may have been adequate 50 years ago when the population was 10 million, but now 4 times as many people are trying to live in almost the same area, and the population is expected to double by the turn of the century. What kind of development could provide for the Egyptians? And what impact will Egypt have on the Mediterranean in the future? These poverty-stricken shores on the Mediterranean are perhaps the real test of the action plan.
Many people are aware about the pollution effect of industrialization and the patterns of consumption in industrialized nations, and it is common knowledge that the most polluted area of the Mediterranean is the curve between Barcelona and Genoa. But this should not allow us to forget completely another source of pollution, that's poverty on the southern part of the Mediterranean. Because people, when they are living in extremely poor conditions, they cannot afford the luxury of taking care of their environment.
Even for a poor country, the solution that the action plan would suggest is to tie environmental protection to development. For Egypt, a large part of her economic success must lie in establishing new industries and communities, but in the desert, rather than on the banks of the Nile or on the shores of the Mediterranean. Only an optimist could claim that this will be an easy task, for the psychological opposition to the desert is deep-rooted and based on a history of failure.
Egypt is a typical example where we can see that the basic needs of the population have to be satisfied, because there is no environment protection unless the basic needs can be satisfied. And the basic needs are sometimes boiling down to simple things as food for everybody, shelter for everybody, security for everybody. But in spite of this fact, Egypt is making great progress. Naturally, taking account the economic possibilities and the needs. If you have to have a choice whether to invest in a sewerage system and avoid, by investing in such a sewerage system, cholera and typhoid, or to invest in hospitals to treat the typhoid and cholera cases, you better invest in sewerage system. And this is exactly where Egypt is doing certain things. And the treaty that they will sign will help them even further, because this is exactly in the spirit of the treaty, to prevent, not to cure.
While Egypt lacks the native wealth to push ahead rapidly with its development plans, there are no such constraints further to the west, in Algeria. Ships wait to unload machinery, food, and raw materials. There is a delay because of poor unloading facilities in the port of Algiers. Algeria is well off because of its rich supply of gas and oil. It also has a relatively high level of foreign investment. The result is industrialization that echoes that of the developed nations on the northern shores of the Mediterranean. The question for Kesh is whether this development will lead to coastal pollution like that of Spain, Italy, and France. And until about a year ago, the Algerians were troubled by another, more sinister question. To what extent was the environmental movement a conspiracy to hold back industrialization in the Third World? As they saw it, the Mediterranean Action Plan could be instrumental in restricting their industrial development, keeping them in a state of poverty and forcing their unemployed to migrate to the factories of Northern Europe. These women have not seen their husbands and sons for 5 years. Several years ago, the late President Boumediene said, "If improving the environment means less bread for the Algerians, then I am against it." For the Algerians, like the Egyptians, the state of the Mediterranean is not a priority. Food and shelter are much more central to their needs. Kesh figured that he would have to convince the Algerians that anti-pollution measures were of immediate economic benefit to them. And in the last year, the Algerians have dropped their opposition to the Mediterranean Action Plan.
Algeria is an example of a country which in the last 10 years went through a very rapid economic development. And therefore, their problems today are different than they have been 10 years ago. 10 years ago, the environmental problems practically didn't exist in Algeria. Today, their environmental problems are visible. 10 years ago, countries like Algeria might have thought, and some of them did actually, that environmental protection is preached by the developed countries in order to slow down the development of the developing countries. Today, I don't believe that anybody believes in it, even in developing countries. And this is a definite change in their approach to the Mediterranean Action Plan and towards the treaty they are negotiating today. Today, it is very clear that the treaty will require certain sacrifices, economic sacrifices. But it is also clear that the burden, the heaviest financial burden, will be distributed according to the amount of pollutants entering the Mediterranean Sea from different countries. In other words, a developing country will have to pay very little. A developed country, which contributes a lot to the pollution of the Mediterranean, will pay a lot.
One country that has already had to pay a lot is France. In the industrial zone of Fos, the French have already had to face the costs of cleaning up heavily polluting industries. New industries are now only permitted in this area if they can meet the required standards. And it turns out that it is relatively cheap for them to meet even rigorous standards as long as they are planned for from the start. The real difficulties arise in dealing with an older industrial plant, such as the Naphtha Shami petrochemical complex. Built in the 1920s, it was extended in the late 60s. Because of its age, the plant was designed with little consideration for the environment. The plant's designers took for granted the prevailing view of industrialists at that time that the sea was an acceptable dump. The tactic adopted here has been persuasion. The government agency involved has, in the course of meetings, spread over 5 years, persuaded the management to change the plant from the inside out. It was just too expensive to treat the huge volume of effluent they originally produced. But if this could be reduced, they argued, it would leave a smaller and more manageable effluent problem. They also argued that chemicals recovered might find a productive use. The tactic worked. Mercury and hydrocarbons once flowed from the factory outlets. Now that has been changed, but at a price. Over $30 million for the two oldest chemical plants alone. And to clean up the entire Foss development has cost $96 million so far. Pollution, however, has been reduced by 90% in 5 years.
Foss has been a very important example for us in persuading the government to negotiate a treaty that would control the land-based source of pollutants, because it showed clearly that you will not be able to maintain the old standards, that you will have to change your factories to comply with systems that are better, that will provide better environmental protection. Foss, in other words, has proved that it can be done, and Foss proved something else also, that unless you do it from the very beginning, when you start planning your factory, it will cost you more if you will do it later.
Pollution levels around the Mediterranean. The thicker the black line, the greater the cost to clean up the area. For France alone, it will cost over $20 billion a year. Now our story moves to Geneva. It's February 1979. The government experts on environment are meeting to review progress on the action plan. In effect, Keshkesh's planning is on trial, and so also is his optimism and determination. But this meeting will reveal the real commitment of the Mediterranean nations to saving their sea. Again, though, there is a sense about the meeting of a unique experiment in international relations. Albania is still the only absentee.
Morning, George. Good morning. How are you? Putting some water in my papers. How are you? Very good.
The main issue is the extent to which the nations will take over from the UN Environment Program the cost of funding the monitoring program. Although national laboratories do the work, the research is funded mostly by UNEP grants. Now UNEP wants the nations to pay the bill. France, Italy, and Spain will have to pay the most. And for half a day, there is pressure from these countries on Keshkesh to justify certain research projects.
Señores delegados, buenos días.
Are the new laboratories in the less developed countries adequate?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Aren't some of the projects too complex and sophisticated for this stage?
Behind
all the questioning lies the issue of the control of data.
It will be difficult in long run to estimate the present level of pollution of the Mediterranean.
The French, Italian, and Spanish, for example, have their own open sea projects. Why then should they help pay for other Mediterranean countries to do the same work? Eventually, all is reasonably settled. Keshkesh had expected a rough ride, and at the end of the day, there is a jewel in the crowning settlement that is of real value to the Mediterranean. For what comes through unmistakably is that the delegates are showing the real determination of their countries to go ahead with the treaty that they have been negotiating slowly and painstakingly over the past 2 years. And that is what happened. For 5 months later, in June 1979, Stefan Keshkesh achieved his aim when all the nations met again and agreed on the language of the treaty to control land-based pollution. It will be signed in Athens on July 5th, 1980. Then, what is proposed for the treatment of sewage in Athens will have to happen by law at other large Mediterranean towns and cities. Marseille, Barcelona, Genoa, Tel Aviv, Beirut, Alexandria. All of these great cities will be faced with huge bills running into hundreds of millions of dollars. The cleanup at Foss will have to be repeated at all other industrial complexes. Of course, there will be difficulties.
Many skeptics said at the beginning that we will never succeed to get together countries with different socioeconomic background, cultural background, historic background, countries that were at war with each other. But we demonstrated that we can do it. Manik said, why are you selecting the Mediterranean as the first region where you try to do something? Our answer was exactly for the reason, because it is the most difficult reason. If we succeed in that region, we might succeed everywhere.
To achieve the aim of the treaty will take at least another 10 or 20 years. Still, it is a prototype. Individual peoples and nations will probably never fully understand one another. But the action plan shows that it is possible for them to recognize at least one problem they have in common and come together to resolve it cooperatively.